everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Food for Thought, a series of interviews EnWave is conducting with business leaders in the food industry, covering everything from consumer packaged goods to food supply chains to the world of product development. The focus of Food for Thought is how we can rethink food in a post-COVID-19 world. Our guest today is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Dr. Charlebois is the former Dean of the Rowe School of Business at Dalhousie University. He co-founded the University of Guelph's Food Institute and has also taught at the University of Regina and University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Charlebois is the author of 5 books on global food systems and is a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail, BNN Bloomberg, and the Canadian Grocer. Dr. Charlebois, welcome to Food for Thought, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you.
Perfect. Let's jump right in. So, firstly, I want to talk about something that's a very hot topic these days, alternative proteins. And I'm wondering if you can reframe for the average Canadian what the debate should actually revolve around versus plant versus animal-based diets, using facts or objectivity as opposed to subjectivity and simply viewpoints. Is there a case based on facts that it's simply not sustainable based on future population growth, or is it unsustainable at current levels? What insight might you give to reframe the argument to, traditionally consumers that are used to animal-based, but are seemingly being pulled to plant-based by the market?
Yeah, it's so good question. I mean, it was an ongoing debate, at least before COVID, for the last couple of years. A lot of people were wondering, what is the future of protein? A mixture of different sources is what was going to be, or what was being offered to Canadians, probably for the first time. I mean, Beyond Meat democratized the notion of vegetable proteins by allowing them to be available on the market. For the longest time, people felt that lentils, chickpeas are great, but they go in a salad, and people didn't know how. They didn't see them as a source of protein, but they are. And Beyond Meat made them edible, I guess, in a certain way, because a lot of people just didn't see chickpeas or lentils as delicious as a steak on a barbecue. And so that bridge was made, but it did create a lot of tension between the two camps, I guess, between animal proteins and animal and vegetable. So is it more sustainable? Well, of course, I'm a scientist, so the best answer is that I can provide you is it depends. Depends what metrics you're looking at. Of course, if someone actually eats 90 kilos of beef every year, that's a problem. It's a problem related to the environment. It's a problem related to health. So there is probably a sustainable way of eating different types of meat, and nutritionally, actually, there's probably some value there as well. It's just the debate has been so divisive, we kind of forgot that the two can actually work together. And I hope that I at the beginning of 2020, things were changing already before COVID. So I suspect, hopefully, coming out of this, the language will be a little bit different, or at least the same as the beginning of the year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One wildcard source of protein that many in the Western world at least aren't familiar with is insect proteins. Do you see a future for that at all in the Western diet 5-10 years down the road?
I think so. I do so. Based on our numbers, of course, not a whole lot of people are interested in eating insects, of course, but I would say that there is potential there, some interest it is the cheapest way to produce protein, to be honest. And it's hard to argue when you look at the metrics and you look at some of the studies out there. It is really interesting what you can do. And I've actually eaten insects myself, and Yeah, beyond the yuck factor, you can actually start eating different granola bars, different products, and consider insects as an ingredient. And so I do believe that there is potential there. There's also a lot of potential for lab-grown meat. Before COVID, we were expecting the United States to approve the commercialization of lab-grown meat, but I'm not sure if it's still ongoing, but that is also of interest.
Okay, very interesting. Shifting to more Canada's food security and the North American food supply chain. Post COVID-19, I think there's a big shift or some shifts coming to the industry. What can the Canadian government do to help the Canadian economy capture more value within the food supply chain? And kind of where I'm going with this is, Canada is one of the largest wheat producers and exporters in the world. And for example, that wheat, might be exported to Italy, produced into pasta, put back on a truck to the Western European coast, and then shipped back to Canadians to eat in the form of pasta. Is there, this is one example, but are there ways that we can capture more of that value within Canada? I know it's difficult because we're not the most population dense country, but are there some, examples that you could give of how we could capture more of that value than simply being an export focused nation?
Oh, I would say so. I've been claiming this for 20 years. We don't process enough. We think about commodities, but we don't necessarily think about value-added products. And this is a big myth. In fact, during COVID, you're seeing it. Processing is a big flaw in Canada. We're still not doing all that great. If we can actually if you cannot have a strong agri-food sector without a strong processing sector, and that needs to be recognized more and more. And I suspect that during COVID, we're going to do that. Or after COVID, we're going to recognize that a little bit more, hopefully, anyways. And that applies to wheat, that applies to lentils, chickpeas. AGT in Saskatchewan, kind of did that. It was born on the basis of adding value to commodities grown in the prairies. We can do the same with other commodities.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've also seen a drastic rise in food wastage during COVID-19. And largely this is a result of food service demand going to zero. We're seeing things like entire crops of vegetables being dumped into landfills, plowed back into fields. We're seeing livestock being euthanized because of a bottleneck in processing capacity because of the large plants in Alberta being shut down. Are these issues that existed before, and this black swan event has simply brought them to light? Was the food system bursting at the seams, or will a lot of these problems that are getting a lot of media attention go away once there's sort of equilibrium in the market?
I certainly hope not, but I think that's exactly what's going to happen, unfortunately. I've seen it before. We've gone through crises in the past. Like I said, I've been at this for 20 years, and we're kind of repeating ourselves unless we really want to change things. And I suspect it would have to be commodity specific. I'd say that really, when it comes to pulses, there is an ongoing initiative that seems to be working so far, and that's Proteins Industries Canada. And that really has mobilized several stakeholders around a value chain for pulses in the West. And you've seen provinces embrace that approach. You've seen a lot of different stakeholders revolve around PIC, and that because it is a super cluster, it's one way to do it, and it seems to be working. And hopefully there'll be more successes down the road. But we could actually create a super cluster for different commodities or for different markets. PIC is all about a market-driven agenda. And typically in Canada, we've always looked at commodities and just felt, well, if we can grow it a market will come, but it doesn't necessarily work that way anymore. You have to figure out what the market is looking for, what are the gaps, what are the opportunities, and work your way back. And designing on an architecture, an industrial architecture around those, based on those gaps, based on those needs that you see.
Mm-hmm. Just touching on the processing piece, I believe the stat is 90% of Canada's beef supply comes from the 3 plants in southern Alberta. Do you see that as too much concentration risk in terms of from a Canadian food security perspective, or is simply it's a high volume, low margin business and it requires large companies like a Cargill or a JBS to be able to, keep the cost of meat down? Or is there a more sustainable model where you don't have so much of the capacity tied up within 3 facilities feeding an entire nation essentially?
Well, the industry's architecture is the product of what consumers want, and that's cheap food. So and that's the key here. If that changes, leaving COVID into another era, maybe we'll see something else. But for the time being, I actually don't see any significant changes. We talk about local food, we talk about different initiatives, but it will end up costing more. So are consumers willing to pay for value? I don't know. We're going into a great recession right now. So there are fewer consumers who can afford a value-added product. So it's going to be very difficult to establish some sort of a new social contract between consumers and the food industry. But my guess is that consumers won't have a choice but to accept higher food prices because they're going up. I mean, you can see right now across the supply chain, it does cost more to produce food. So eventually, prices will have to go up.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really interesting point. Switching gears a little bit, you've given some keynote speeches in the past on food fraud that you've said is apparent in the global food supply chain. Can you articulate to the average consumer, what do you mean by food fraud?
Well, what I mean by food fraud, well, essentially, I would say that food fraud is categorized in 3 ways. One, you may actually have, say, a product that is misrepresented. Of course, for all food fraud, you're looking at mislabeling, but there is misrepresentation. For example, you are selling a product as an organic product, but it's not. So that's misrepresentation. Also, you have counterfeiting, of course, because you have theft all across the supply chain, and that gets repurposed. And finally, adulteration, replacing one ingredient with another cheaper one, which is, of course, also known as economically motivated adulteration. And that's the hardest one to catch. And often you would see liquids, spices, you would see different products being affected by food fraud. And it is absolutely a major issue for sure. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how we tackle this. And the only way to do it is to actually accommodate whistleblowers, because they'll have data, they'll have information, and also accommodating industry as well, because they know that there are some people that are some companies are problems and they're affecting the reputation of an entire sector, and that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. This leads well into my next question, which was, food traceability is becoming a big theme in terms of building sustainable food chains. We're seeing blockchain technologies being rolled out by the likes of IBM and applied to large scale farming. We're seeing tech startups focus specifically on traceability and food safety. We're seeing, CPG products coming out that have a lot code on the back of them where you can look it up online and see exactly where your product was harvested. are these nice to haves, or in the spirit of food fraud and building a more transparent food chain, do you foresee, things of this nature becoming a requirement to have your food on the shelves at national grocery retailers? Or like you said, it'll ultimately decide, do consumers want the lowest cost product or a transparent, higher quality potentially product?
Well, I think it's always hard to consider the market as an homogeneous entity. And this is what's happening right now, believing that really consumers are all different. They have different needs. Some people will want different kinds of food. Some people will want the same food. But I think because we're cooking more during COVID, because we actually are becoming more sophisticated, I suspect that is going to change. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how things go with people having more knowledge about food, and they've been able to read the instructor's manual of their stove. I mean, some of them actually. I mean, you actually have apartments nowadays rented without a stove, a stoveless apartment. There are some in Toronto being rented for $3,300 without a stove. There's not even a place for a stove. So you can see that really things were going in a specific direction. It'll be interesting to see if there's going to be a shift there a little bit as a result of this recession.
Right. And speaking of consumer education, where do you think the onus lies in terms of consumers better understanding what goes into their food? Because now I think consumers, when they go to the grocery store, they have a little bit more time than they did 2 months ago, where we were always go, 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 and they're looking what's on the back of their granola bar or whichever product they're looking at. And, they're hearing lots of things about bad, refined sugars and high carbohydrate products and different things that have traditionally been in, large scale CPG products. Is this a matter of consumers empowering themselves and wanting to, live a healthier lifestyle? Is it more regulation in terms of how companies market their products and how transparent they are with, what actually goes into them?
Transparency is certainly something that consumers are expecting, but what I think is happening is that, and of course, in return, the industry has tried to provide transparency to consumers, only to find out that perhaps some of the things that consumers are seeing may not be appreciated or may not be what they were expecting. And COVID is really shining a light on some of the practices that we see on farms. For example, dairy cows producing 10 times the amount of milk they would normally produce, just because of genetics and how they're built, how they're designed. The call of hogs right now, because they are being euthanized because there's no spot for them in slaughtering. The milk dumping. I mean, all of these things are probably getting people to think differently about food. You can make the system transparent, but be careful what you wish for. People may not like what you're doing, even though you think it's a lifestyle and it's part of what you do, which could actually get people to eat differently. So transparency is a very interesting concept in agriculture, because it doesn't necessarily mean if the system is more transparent, it doesn't necessarily mean it's actually better. You could make things worse.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sometimes when you open the curtain, you don't always like what you thought was going on. So no, that's a great point. Speaking of food pricing, I think we're going to, likely see a potentially scary number of restaurants not open back up because of COVID-19. And you'd mentioned food costs. Because of increased competition in the restaurant space in recent years, there's almost been a race to the bottom in terms of prices. Do you think that restaurants should be increasing their prices across the board to make for a sustainable industry and a higher quality restaurant experience? Or do you think that consumers in North America, at least, are always going to opt for sort of the lower cost basis? I mean, we've heard some staggering numbers, well up above 50% of restaurants not opening up. And that's, a favorite pastime of a lot of, Canadian and Americans.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I actually do think that it is going to be a challenge in the future. There's, this big urban-rural divide we have is really hurting us as a society, I guess. Only 2% of the population will live on farms. It doesn't necessarily mean that 98% should not be served what they're looking for. Misunderstanding of farming is hurting our perception of food. It's also hurting policy as well, to be honest. I mean, I think we do have some governments out there that don't necessarily they're not avoiding agriculture, they just misunderstand it. And that leads to a confusing sort of relationship between society, governments, and industry.
Mm-hmm. So post-COVID, are you optimistic about things that will change? I mean, some things we've spoke about in the last half hour, you think that will likely go back to sort of the way they were, but is there part of you that's optimistic that this is an event that's touched every part of the supply chain, every part of society? Are you optimistic in humanity, changing, or do you think we'll go back to our old ways?
Well, maybe it's wishful thinking, but I do hope things are going to change, but I don't think they will, unfortunately. COVID is interesting because it is long. I mean, it's not just a snowstorm. It's not just a hurricane. It's not just an earthquake. It has affected the entire planet within months. And it has made a lot of people feel vulnerable, even though it was virtual or it wasn't real. It did make people feel vulnerable. So that's going to be interesting to see. If there is any interesting legacy in COVID, that should be one of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to be respectful of your time, so I think we only have time for a couple more questions, but I wanted to ask about the retail experience. So, in the past 5-10 years, grocery stores have become an immersive experience. These companies have made huge investments in making the retail shopping experience very seamless and customer friendly. And all of a sudden with COVID, we're now forced to maintain distance from other customers. The cashier, which was once, I want to say a friendly place, but I've found cashiers to actually be really friendly right now, which has been a positive. But there's glass barriers. Do you see these things reverting back, or do you think that people are going to be, overly concerned from a germ perspective, and then as a result, opting for more, grocery pickup, the D2C type, and meal kits like a Good Food or a HelloFresh? Do you see those continuing to go on, or people, once sort of this tide has blown over, which we don't know when it will be, people will want to go back to, seeing their neighbors at the grocery stores and striking up conversations?
I think we're social beasts. I think we will always want to interact with people. Right now, of course, we're conscious of the fact that we may endanger other people's lives, including our own. And so I think this is just a bubble. And I think beyond that, of course, we will go back to the grocery store. But the e-commerce part is undeniably there from now on. I mean, before COVID, 3% of the population were buying food online on a regular basis. And now that percentage to perhaps exceed 20%. So that would be a huge shift, and the industry is not ready. But this could actually create this phenomenon, what I call this democratization of supply chains. As soon as e-commerce exists in people's minds, it actually does give an opportunity to any company in the food business to actually have a shot at the consumer, and that's going to be very interesting. Farmers, processors, anybody can actually sell food to the consumer. Sysco Canada is now selling food to consumers. And 2 months ago, if you would have asked me if Sysco Canada would have been selling food to consumers, I would have told you you're on good cannabis. But it did happen. It did happen. It's happening now. So a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, no, I think GFS is doing the same. And I mean, I agree with you. 2 months ago, you never would have saw that. I guess my last question is, a lot of the news that consumers see about food, there's a lot of people probably scared about. They're seeing, McDonald's is going to, non-Canadian beef out of necessity. They're hearing about these plant shutdowns and COVID, affecting a lot of these plants in Southern Alberta. What would you say to just the average consumer about, food in the next 6 months? Should they be worried that Canada is going to run out of food? Or there's, I know the grocery stores have been doing a great job of stepping up, and all the frontline workers. What would you leave people with as a message, as we're, on the horizon maybe of the economy opening up sometime in the next 6 to 8 weeks?
Well, you have to take a step back and rationalize some of the decisions happening right now. So if you go back to McDonald's, procuring meat out of the United States and elsewhere, I would say this, Canada running out of beef, McDonald's did, and that's why it went south. There's a big difference. High River has McDonald's as its biggest customer, and frankly, because McDonald's went south, it actually will put less pressure on High River. So that plant can provide beef to other outlets. So it was actually a good move. So you have to think about things from a systems perspective and understand the big picture. And if you do take the time to understand the big picture, you'll feel safe. You'll feel that the food industry can deliver, can do a good job, and will continue to do so.
Oh, that's really interesting perspective. I want to thank you, Dr. Charlebois, for taking the time to speak with us, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure.